Aparna, I think.
Yeah, I was just, should we give a couple of minutes for?
I think we can go ahead and start just to make sure we have time for everything, and then
Yeah.
as folks trickle in, they will do so.
Okay, sounds good. So welcome everyone. Before we begin this Gender Cafe, I want to quickly introduce the Society of Gender Professionals for those of you who may not already be familiar with us. Society of Gender Professionals, or SGP, is an international association of gender practitioners, academics, activists who are dedicated to promoting feminist action and applied research and raising the profile of gender expertise around the world. On the screen, you can see our mission, which includes supporting member collaboration, network building, mentoring, leadership, and advancing gender equity. Based on the data available on our registered members, we can share an overview of where our membership is. So here you can see, based on geographical location, where the membership of SGP is based. Listed are 80 countries where SGP's members are based, who have signed up since the membership system was set up in 2019. The mapping gives a visualization of the geographic spread. There are 45 countries where we have about 225 members registered to date, registered members across all continents. And we also have, broadly, we also have a followership on social media. And if we also track their geographical location, we have followers and supporters from almost 114 different countries. So thank you so much for staying engaged with our network. So this is a quick snapshot of, again, our followership on different platforms. Overall, we have about 30 to 40,000 members, subscribers across continents through various platforms, social media, our newsletter, and our direct membership. And we'll share more about how you can become a member if you aren't already at the end of this session today. So I'd quickly like to share what gender cafes are about. So this is the idea behind holding these conversations is to foster production and dissemination of applied gender research. And we try to have these events every few months. Earlier this year, around the CSW conference, we held a couple of gender cafes on gender justice and environmental justice, the intersections of those. And more recently, we are now having this series on gender and sex inclusive data collection. So the main idea behind gender cafes is to provide a space for feminist discussion and collaboration. And any of you can actually propose to hold a gender cafe if there's a certain topic you would like us to center for these discussions. You can help us organize one. There's a proposal form on our website, which we'll share in the follow-up email. Before we dive into today's session, I'd like to update you that we will be having, after our panelists have a chance to share their insights, we will have 4 breakout rooms where we will divide up we are currently in the main Zoom room, and we will divide up this room into 4 breakout rooms for more intimate discussions. And it will hopefully give you a chance to ask some questions to our panelists that you won't in the main room. We will not have space for that due to time constraints. So I'll now give the mic to Erika Ridergaard, who is our moderator for today. And Erika, please take over the mic, and would love if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you, Aparna. So hi, everyone. It's really great to see many of you here today. Aparna, could you go to the slide with the goals, the agenda for today, please? So this is me, agenda and goals, and then the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll start by taking us through the agenda and then the goals for today, and then I'll do a short introduction to our topic for today, and we'll have presentations from 3 panelists that I'm very excited about personally. And then we'll have, like Aparna said, a facilitated breakout room group discussion. And then we'll have a little report back from the breakout rooms, and then we will end it there. So if you could go to the goals slide, Aparna. And just so you know, we don't see the presentation. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Perfect. So the goals of this Gender Cafe is that we as gender professionals can become more aware of the ethical and quality considerations around collecting sex and gender data, and that we're more able to conduct data collection that is inclusive and serves social justice. So those are our goals today, and we can probably promise to provide you with education and insights, but we cannot give you the answer. So you'll walk away from here with some more education, some more insight, but probably not the final answer to these questions. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide. So I'll give a short introduction to what we're going to discuss here today before we jump over to our panelists. We here are gender professionals in one way or another, and we're also internet users, we're beneficiaries of public services, we could be voters, etc. And so we're both consumers and producers of data. Data collection is important, especially, sorry, Aparna, we see the slide with my name. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. And data collection is important, especially collecting data about those who experience marginalization and being counted through some form of data collection. It can grant us access to resources and inclusion, such as accessing services, voting, or other benefits within our societies. But then on the other hand, classification has been used to exclude those that don't fall within the norm. And also, when we classify people across borders and boundaries, that could ignore differences in our identities and how we talk about them and how we think about ourselves. And it can also ignore differences in identities over time or how our identities change. So we hope that this discussion can help you all and us as well as gender professionals, and that we can learn about how to collect data that serves social justice. And we hope as well that maybe we can walk away from here with some concrete and practical tools and thoughts on how to collect data more inclusively. And now I will turn to our presenters. Next slide, please. Thank you. Brinda Lakshmi K is a queer feminist researcher and advocacy professional working at the intersection of gender, sexuality, human rights, and technology. And currently they're authoring a study called Gendering of Development in India, post the Trans Act of 2019, and they lead capacity building and advocacy at the feminist organization called Point of View. So Brinda, I have a couple of questions for you. How do you, based on your experience, see that data collection can affect access to services like healthcare and social services? And do you have any good examples of how we can best collect data together with the people that data collection is about?
Right. So I am based in India, and my experience is primarily from India and the South Asian subcontinent. So in India, introduction of a digital process. So when you're talking about data collection, there's been very high level of digitization happening right now, and digitization has been introduced as the solution of sort to solve the problem of lack of data by introducing digital processes, methods, or methods of collecting data. Then is being seen as a solution to address the data gap, when in fact there are much bigger problems that need to be answered first. Like, for instance, introduction of a digital process does not remove the discriminations faced by transgender persons. And what do I mean by transgender persons? For people who may not be aware, these are individuals who don't identify with the gender assigned to them at birth, right? So the discriminations and stigmas faced by them are simply replicated by digital data collection processes and systems. So in order to enter any database, individuals require valid identification documents in their self-identified gender and their self-identified name, both offline and online. The inability to procure valid identification documents, severely affects their ability to access different services. And this is usually the case with transgender persons in most countries in the world, and this is the case even in India. In the Indian context, also enough public or private databases do not include data on transgender persons or gender non-conforming persons, intersex persons. In fact, there is no provision for them to be even like make themselves visible because of the kind of discrimination they face. And this is in spite of the right of every individual to self-identify their gender being recognized in the country. This recognition came with the Supreme Court verdict that came out in 2014, the Nalsa versus Union of India verdict. This verdict recognized the right of every individual to self-identify their gender as male, female, or transgender. And in spite of this verdict, and a law was later passed in 2019, but that law has several problems, and I will talk about that as well. In spite of the law and in spite of this verdict, transgender persons continue to struggle to enter data systems or databases and access different services and even basic rights like healthcare, right? This has severely affected their access to COVID vaccination as well. When you say you need a valid ID document to actually access or get COVID vaccine, transgender persons get left out because they don't have a valid ID to access the vaccination, for instance, right? And the other problem also, the other side is the systems don't have enough ways through which trans persons can enter data systems. And at the same time, the lack of data is also used as the excuse for lack of budget allocation in different state welfare programs to address the challenges or like the inclusion of transgender persons. The government's excuse is that we don't have enough data on transgender persons, and in some states, they also have said that we don't actually have transgender persons in our state, so we don't need to actually allocate budget. So policy allocation or policy should come in first, right? Needs to be first, irrespective of whether there are enough trans persons in the state or not. Independent of that, there should be policy allocation, budget allocation to address the needs of the transgender persons, whereas that doesn't happen usually, or that's not the case. And even where there are databases, like for instance, the census of 2011, right? That census for the first time attempted to enumerate transgender persons under this category called others. Whereas there were a lot of problems with the data collected under others category as well. There was conflation between sex and gender. Now, I'm guessing Ugly will go further into this in their sort of presentation. But a brief description would be sex is biological, and it's based on biological characteristics, your hormones, your organs, whereas gender is more self-identified, how you see yourself, right? When you conflate the two, then the data also becomes conflated, right? So others category included data on transgender persons, intersex persons, and also children. So there was lack of clarity on who this data actually is on, right, to actually make valid policy decisions or development decisions to address transgender persons, right? And also not all transgender identities were included in this category. So India is a country which has a history of indigenous transgender identities. So the usual expectation is a transgender person would be from that indigenous identity. The indigenous identities are Hijra, Kinnar, Aravani. These are some of the identities, indigenous identities, and they are persons who are assigned male at birth. And the expectation is for any transgender person to identify themselves as Hijra, look and sound a certain way. And if they don't look and sound that way, then you don't fit into that category and you're not recognized as being transgender. So this excludes other identities, individuals who identify themselves as trans men, gender fluid, non-binary, all other, so many other identities are left out of this whole spectrum again. So also, when it comes to census of 2011, the enumerators were not also sensitized to understand the distinction between the different identities, gender and sex, intersex and transgender. These are very crucial factors. Like when you're collecting data, enumerators need to be sensitized, right? To collect the right kind of data. And when they are not, then that is also a problem. So there's also, when being transgender also means you're going to someone's home to collect data on census, for census, they're not going to come out in front of their family and say, I'm transgender. When being transgender is seen as, something odd. So how do you then include people like that in your database, in the census? So that was not thought through as well. You're putting their privacy at risk. And this continues to be the case, even though this database is now about 11, 12 years old, right? There's continued insensitivity when it comes to collecting data on transgender persons. Their privacy is still not taken into consideration, right? And with the new law that has just come out in 2019, Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. Now, this law describes a two-step process through which every person has to procure some sort of medical certificate to be to identify themselves within the binary of male or female, right? And this means a doctor needs to certify them. And this individuals continue to face a lot of discrimination, and they in order to get these certificates, doctors still check them physically, and they undergo a lot of inappropriate treatment, which we would typically describe as harassment, sexual harassment even. But people don't have another alternative when it comes to procuring certificates, because they need a valid identification document. They cannot get a valid identification document without actually putting themselves through this kind of very inhuman behavior, like treatment, actually, right? So that is another challenge. people are having to subject themselves to very inhuman sort of treatment in order to actually self-identify themselves in their self-identified gender, right? And different when you, so this is in the public sector, I'm talking about ID documents. So if you're looking at private sector, in private sector as well, there aren't sufficient provisions to include transgender persons. Not all or like enough number of insurance service providers have a gender category to actually recognize transgender persons or for them to access their services. They don't cover the gender affirmative process for trans persons as well, and every other service. When you're looking at a banking service or like travel, anything else also, then you need a valid identification document in order to access any service. So that takes them back to the same cycle of having to go through the government process and not being able to prove who they are. So that also cuts them off from private sector services as well. And there has been large scale data leaks, right? So India has a biometric based ID, which is Aadhaar, and Aadhaar data has been going through massive data leaks, and this includes data of trans persons as well. And it's quite well known that when people are already in at the margins, are historically marginalized, they are more likely to face higher level of discrimination. If the data gets out, they may be outed to their family, they may face a lot of violence. And in fact, already many trans persons run away from home because they face a lot of violence from their family, and they run away from their homes. So leaking their data only like makes them more vulnerable to such attacks, and also among other their professional circles and their peers as well. So under all these circumstances, the best way to think about data collection then would be to not ask people to reveal their gender in order to access basic services, right? It should be a choice to self-identify. And usually people who have the choice of self-identifying themselves or choosing not to disclose their gender usually are people who have the privilege of not depending on the state. When you're dependent on the state for even your basic food, right, then you're forced to reveal your gender identity. And that is beyond just discrimination. It goes beyond even basic human rights, right? I mean, I'm trying to frame this politically correct, but you want to know what's in a person's pants before you give them food, and that's just not fair. That's just not fair at all. And this is happening, and this is something that the state is doing to its own people. And so in order to counter that, then it is important that you base it on human rights, and not on data. Decisions should be made based on human rights and not based on data. Taking decisions based on purely data and not looking at safe collection processes, data collection processes, then makes people even more vulnerable. So making decisions based on human rights instead of data would be a safer way to look at it, and also giving people the option of self-identifying themselves, right, and not forcing them to reveal their gender identity would be a good way to look at gender data collection. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brinda. This is really interesting and also quite disturbing. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise. And now I will move to our next speaker, who is Liane van der Merwe. Aparna, could you share the slides, please? And while Aparna shares the slides, I'll say that Liane is a self-identified South African colored transgender woman, and she is the founder and the director of Social Health and Empowerment Feminist Collective, also called SHE. This is an organization that is working to bring the political voice of transgender women into research, practice, and advocacy. And Leanne has also worked extensively on research projects focused on transgender people, and she has published on transgender issues and HIV in peer-reviewed journals. And Leanne, based on your extensive experience, I wanted to ask you, how can academic studies collect data with and for transgender communities, and especially maybe outside of a North American or European context, since we have this research or studies tend to focus on those areas where there are resources. And do you have some good examples of when data was collected with transgender communities in South Africa, where you work?
Thank you, colleagues. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good evening, colleagues. Greetings from South Africa. As said, my name is Leanne. I work for Social Health and Empowerment, and we are a feminist collective of trans women in South Africa, but working a little more at the regional level. Some people call me an academic. I don't. I want to, first recognize all of the colleagues in the room. And the first thing that I want to speak to is the decolonization of language, because language is never innocent. Trans and transgender is, as most other things from the developed world, a language set that is imposed on developing contexts. When we talk about data collection, it's really important that we get it and we get it right. If we are not counted, that means we don't count. There are numerous ethnic terms in Africa used to describe gender nonconformity, but the West taught us that those approaches and terms are stigmatizing. And be that as it may, these remain terms that are community derived and implemented. So the danger with using Western frameworks to analyze and describe our gender identities is most often, most of those conceptions go missing. So hijras have long been recognized in India as, as a distinct cultural community with unique healthcare needs, similarly with Katui in Thailand, and the list goes on and on. The second most important thing that I want to touch on this evening is to recognize that when institutions don't understand our unique identities and issues, that often translates into epidemiological and resultantly programmatic and financial invisibilization. So prior to PEPFAR and the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria making an investment in trans women in South Africa as a key population, our government did not recognize our identity, our data, and therefore our unique healthcare needs. Research studies collecting data on South African transgender women have long been the subject of master's and PhD students from the US and Europe, lacking the seriousness required to address HIV and other healthcare needs in this marginalized and underrepresented community. Appropriate data collection is the cornerstone of health planning and resource allocation. And so it comes as no surprise to be put on a 20-year waiting list when accessing gender affirmation surgery in South Africa. Therefore, the idea of gender responsive budgeting in South Africa and elsewhere remains a utopia for communities of diverse gender expression. I love that the question asked, how can we collect data with transgender communities and not on transgender communities? Because as I said in my framing, language matters and language is never innocent. The days of students in the academic project selling research efforts in the name of empowerment to trans community, those days are long gone. I will be the first to recognize that as a transgender woman and a scholar, that much research is needed to further understand community health needs of trans women in South Africa. And so the data for me is best collected with the community. I'm appealing to all of us here to please set aside the discourse that set up scientists and community as being mutually exclusive. Many transgender scholars became scientists to rebut this idea that one can only ever be, research can only ever be done on us and not with us. So research or data collection efforts that recognize transgender people as scholars and as contributors to the discourse is always a wonderful place to start. For the first question, I'll stop there, Erica.
Thank you so much. And do you have some good examples of collecting this type of data in your context?
Yes, thank you. So in 2015, after a lot of lobbying and advocacy, the Human Sciences Research Council approached our organization and the community more broadly to conduct the first ever biobehavioral survey to determine HIV prevalence among transgender women. And so in their very first email that they wrote to us and reached out to us and said, this is a priority, the importance of this data is that it will eventually go into planning and budgeting and making sure that resources are allocated in a way that's reflective of justice to the community. And our response to them was that if you are not including transgender women, then we have nothing to say to each other. So basically what we called for was that a transgender woman should be one of the principal investigators to the study, and that the study should employ transgender women, as recruiters in the study and fulfilling other opportunities. Further to that, we also asked, the HSRC to bring us all in a room so that we can imagine what the data collection would look like. One, we would imagine what decision-making process around the data would look like. Two, three, to have a dissemination workshop where we can impart knowledge on everyone to start writing scientifically, because as I said in my in the first response, that this idea that the scientific community and the trans community is dichotomous is becoming more and more blurred, because more and more trans investigators are coming to the front. We are conceptualizing research, we are executing research, we are publishing our findings. Similarly, we conducted the Transgender Women Mobilizing and Preparing for High Impact study, TMAP, which looked at PrEP knowledge among transgender women in South Africa. That study was very much community conceptualized. It was then proposed to scholars. The scholar was at that point was at Johns Hopkins University, is now at University of North Carolina. And again, we followed the same level of inclusion, ensuring that transgender women are involved in the research and having decision-making power at different levels of the project. And in 2016, as a South African investigator, I mobilized resources to conduct a study called It Costs to Be a Woman. And this study explored the cost of being a transgender woman in South Africa. And I'm very happy to say that all of our data identified as transgender women, and the workshops that were held in the name of how do we make decisions collectively, as a group to further this idea that transgender women are very much contributors to the discourse and advocacy and research agenda, on our bodies, on our identities, and, on our issues as South African transgender women. I've put up the slide here to see, in this government form, there was quite an outpouring, of disappointment when the government had, tried to create this effort that on this, on government related forms that we should record gender. And that takes me back to my initial framing of it, is that we should not just only get it, we should get it and get it right. You will see on this form, the government form, it asks gender, and yet it talks about male, female, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer community. And it really brings into focus that saying that, the way to hell is paved with good intentions. So intentionality is there. We need to get it, but we also need to get it right, because having dangerous, having wrong information is, more dangerous than having no information. And so I really want to conclude with this idea that if we are not counted, it means we don't count. It means, we don't make it into health planning. It means we don't form part of the resource allocation, whether that be healthcare, social services, Department of Inland Security, whatever the case may be. If we don't show up appropriately in the data, that often, translates into so many other, issues that our community is experiencing. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Leanne, and thank you for sharing this example with us as well of how good intentions can lead to less good and even harmful outcomes. Thank you. Aparna, could you take us to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. Lastly, I'm pleased to introduce Agli Zavros-Orr, who is an academic working at Federation University, Australia. They're an educational consultant working in diversity and inclusive education. And their work focuses on social justice, anti-bias curriculum approaches, and the ethic of care in education. Agli is founder of Diversity Wise Educational Services. They also serve on the Victorian Government Intersex Advisory Group as an academic and as a community member. And for the last 3 years, they have held the position of Chair of Intersex Human Rights Australia. So Agli, based on your experience and expertise, what are some best practices for collecting data about being born endosex or intersex, and about identifying as transgender or gender nonconforming? And do you have some good examples, again, of collecting this type of data?
Thank you, Erica. Hello, everybody, and good morning from Australia. It's very early here. I want to begin by acknowledging all Indigenous peoples of all lands around the world. I live and work on Kurnai country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander country, in Victoria, in a place that's been named by the colonizers as Gippsland. I live and breathe. I partake in the air and waters that give me life. And I want to acknowledge that this country has not been ceded. It's still contested in terms of ownership, and we are working towards reconciliation, but a long way to go. But I want to acknowledge all Indigenous peoples of all countries. And I also want to acknowledge what Leanne has said about the decolonizing of language as being really critically important here. And I think it's really important that we understand that language does cause us to pause and to think about, how we position each other. And in my work, how we position children and how we position children at birth. Aparna, can you go to the slides? And what I'll do is I'll share the slides with you as I talk, just so that you get some visual ideas about the importance of the topic that I work with. And it's a topic that's important to all of us. It's a topic that touches on the work that Brinda Lakshmi has talked about, and also Leanne. So intersex, here is a definition. It's an umbrella term. And intersex and endosex are important terms for us to engage with. Again, the complexity of language, these terms may be represented differently across the globe, but they are important terms. And I use the definition used by the High Commission of Human Rights, because I think it is important as we work towards unraveling this conundrum, that we do work from clear language and we have consistent language. Populations are mobile, people are moving around the globe, so identity documents are really important, that there is some clarity. And Lee has highlighted for us the tensions that if we don't identify clearly or give people the option to identify clearly, lots of different tensions emerge. Can we share the next slide, please? So one of the things that's important in unraveling this conundrum and getting us to all work well is to get an understanding of this nested approach to understanding bodies, their gender, and their sexuality. So there's some definitions. I'm not going to read them out, but I suppose one of the things that's important from my point of view is that the intersex population is an invisible population across the globe. We have an estimated 1.7% that is being quoted, but it can be higher. Again, it's a matter of definition, and it's what do we include in our definition of who is intersex and what that actually means. So it's really important that when we're collecting data, that we understand that people who are born with an intersex variation, and there are 40 known variations, that they may choose to represent or understand themselves differently. And there's some percentages there from a recent sociological study that was conducted in Australia to try and highlight how people see themselves and how people choose to understand their bodies, their sex, their gender, and their sexuality. And the findings of that study are available at era.org.au, which is the peak organization in Australia for doing work in this space, both in legislation, and we're also working across the globe, doing some work with the World Health Organization around trying to deconstruct this space and to work towards a better understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So it's really important that to understand that across populations, we share common goals, and there are common risks that are faced by peoples. And it's important to acknowledge that, because in the first instance, we all need to access resources, government resources, medical resources, education, housing, financial support, medication, etc. And it's really important that we get this right. Can we have the next slide, please? So I suppose one of the things that I'd like to talk about is, where do we start? And for me, I work in education, and we need to start from helping young people from birth onwards to understand that there are different ways that bodies are represented. And we need to start by, with enrollment forms. We need to start with every piece of document that pertains to a person's identity, that also gives them capacity to become visible in a sense that they have then agency. Now, one of the things that I was aware listening to our previous presenters is that often we hold back information from individuals about their bodies that conflates the issues. And this is the case for people born with intersex variations. They may not find that they have a variation until their adolescent years or much later in life. And that can create harm in ways that they rely in relationships with others, in relationship with themselves, but also how they choose to represent themselves. So the choice of marking female, male, non-binary is not a simple one. It's a very complex one. And for intersex people, if they don't have clear and correct information, this is a point of trauma and stress and anxiety that could lead to long harm. It could actually put them in danger of surviving. So it's important that we get this right. Next slide, please. So in Australia, we have a complex political system where we have states and we have a federal government. And so states have particular rights and drive agendas in around in particular bordered spaces. You know, much like the United States, but it's a little bit more complex because then, right, you know, governments inform different parts, and education sits both across the state and federal systems of government. Health sits across, you know, state and federal. Funding sits across different spaces. You know, things like housing, access to other services like mental health services. You know, it's a really messy space. So getting data and correct data is really important because we can then see the population and be able to provide best services. So we, I suppose, have been thinking about this at ERA, Intersex Human Rights Australia, about how do we move forward in a more inclusive manner that allows for better representation. And rather than it being coercive, because, and I won't go into the intersex story, but, you know, the little piece is that, you know, generally when we're born, doctors will look at our private parts and make a decision. And that decision is not always the correct one. And that has implications. So from birth, we are categorized in particular ways that have long-lasting effects, especially when our bodies choose to develop as they are intended to. And that goes across. And you will notice that I'm not categorizing anyone in terms of their gender and sexuality, but I am speaking more generally. And this is a philosophical position for me in terms of thinking more inclusively of who it is that we're talking about and how it is that we are representing them in the words that we choose to speak about them. And again, what we work for is to bring people forward to then start to think about how they choose to represent themselves, and then to make spaces for that, to make it safe for them in different settings. And for me, this starts in education. We need to be looking at, you know, how we represent bodies in literature, in curriculum content, in all sorts of aspects, how we class children, you know, when we want to group them. They are people. So rather than saying the boys come here, the girls go there, you know, or, you know, how we gender sport, or how we gender, you know, access to education or data about literacy and numeracy. All of that has significant implications. And so when we're collecting data, we need to be thinking about the implications. And I think the important note at the bottom, which goes to what Leanne was also talking about, is a really important note to pause and to think about what we do. And sometimes people say, oh, it's really difficult to put, lots of information on forms. We want simple boxes that we can tick. Yes, as I showed in the previous slide, there is a way we can do that mindfully, but I think there is a space on forms to give people the option to best express their needs. And because language is a challenge, it's good to allow people to find their own words, to talk about their bodies, to talk about their sex, gender, and sexuality, where it's relevant. And I think there's a lot we can all agree that where sex, gender, and sexuality doesn't matter. Access to medical services, access to human rights, access to education, all of those things should be available regardless. They are human rights, and human rights are titled so for a reason. It's about connecting with our humanity. And that's really important for me. And I suppose, in a sense, we're seeing what we are advocating as a movement forward to start us thinking about and simplifying. In Australia, we've had some big debates around data collection at the national level with the ABS data, and we're just starting to tease this data out. It was a big debate around collecting data, and the option was given for people to identify as non-binary. Even just that, identifying as non-binary can cause issues for people. And so it brings into focus something that might not be right in the eyes of others, not of that person. And so that can then put them in a situation where they need to explain. And that's often where the harm can start, especially if they don't have clear information about their bodies, and they've not been given clear and inclusive education to know how to talk about their bodies. And then
to wrap up, start wrapping up.
Thank you.
Make sure we
just finishing now. And so it's important that I suppose we do give that education so that people have the information to make the right choices. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, your perspective from Australia and your other experiences. And thank you for sharing your contact details as well. So now we'll quickly jump into our breakout room activity. And just like Aparna said, it will be a moderated breakout room that you will be put into automatically. I think you will get a prompt and you will click a button and then you'll join the breakout room. We have a few community norms that we wanted to share with you just very quickly before we start off. This is a participative and non-hierarchical community space. Everyone's contributions are valued and respected. We strive to deconstruct the issue using an intersectional lens and centering experiences of non-binary, trans, gender non-conforming, and racialized people, as well as those from the majority world. And we acknowledge the emotional labor of those that are affected by this issue that are sharing their views today. And then lastly, we encourage you to take space and make space. If you have already spoken one time, consider putting your second comment or question in the chat. And next slide, please, Aparna. So we have a few breakout room questions. I won't read them out now, but we'll put them in the chat. And you'll have them in the chat for the breakout room, and your moderator will also have the discussion questions. Thank you, Brenna. And with that, I'll send you off for about maybe 12 minutes or so. So we have some time to wrap up when we come back. I think that we have most people back now who are still with us. So thank you so much, everyone. I think since we only have 2 minutes left, we will skip over our planned reporting back from the breakout rooms. And if you want to share anything in the chat about how your discussion went, feel free to do that. And I will just hand over to Brenna, who will close us out.
Great. Aparna, can you skip to, one more slide? So we've created a feedback survey. Would love for you all to fill that out so that we can learn how to create better and wonderful sessions for you all. Not have enough time. Yeah, thank you, Veronica. I think that is a common, unfortunate factor of the time. So yeah, I just want to name that. I completely understand and agree. Aparna, can you go to the next slide? If you do want to discuss more things like this, we do have a group. It's called Breaking Gender and Sex Binaries. Erica and Aparna and I are in it, as well as some other folks who were here in the crowd. So if you're interested, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat here, and I can add you. We meet once a month, and we have discussions over email as well. Next slide, please. And then the Society of Gender Professionals, we are doing elections. So we would love for you to nominate yourself or others for co-leadership. We have a number of positions open, co-president, treasurer, secretariat at large, some committee co-leads. So please check it out at genderprofessionals.org/nominations, professionals, or which I'm typing right now. I didn't copy. So yeah, hopefully some of you will continue the conversations in our secretariat. And then next slide, please. Last but not least, our contact info. If you have any questions or want to get in touch, info@genderprofessionals.org. You can find us at genderprofs at Twitter, and then Facebook, Gender Professionals, and LinkedIn, Society of Gender Professionals. We've got lots of great community conversations in these places, so we hope you'll join us and continue these conversations. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining today. It was really great to learn, especially from our panelists. I always learn so much whenever I talk to any of you and in these gender cafes. So thanks so much. Have a really great rest of your day or evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks much. Take care, everyone.